Chapter 7. Recapitulation. The salient features of the processes of organic and mental evolution, thus far developed, may be summed up by way of recapitulation as follows. 1. The unicellular organism, from which science traces the pedigree of man, possesses, in common with all other animals, what is generically termed the instinct of self-preservation. In other words, it possesses the inherent intuitional power or faculty of perception antecedent to reason or instruction of the essential laws of its being, including the law of progressive development. 2. This instinctive perception constantly impels to acts preservative of the individual and of the species, including those which are promotive of improvement. 3. This instinctive impulse constitutes the constant force in nature, which is the efficient cause of the evolution of all genera and species. 4. This constant force is modified by environmental conditions, and hence the infinite variety and number of genera and species. 5. The law, however, is progress, and hence there was a constant, though slow rate of progressive development during the primordial epoch, at the close of which a brain was developed and the lowest of the vertebrata appeared. 6. When a brain appeared, it was literally a novum organum, a new organ of mentation, and, true to the Baconian nomenclature, it was the organ of inductive reasoning, and this became the educator of instinct. 7. This education was carried on by the intelligent performance of acts which were useful or preservative, which acts were in process of time converted into instincts and then became the permanent heritage of the species. 8. The objective, or brain, mind is, therefore, the agency by which new emergencies are met and new instincts are developed, and the subjective, or instinctive, mind is the agency by which the new or secondary instincts are assimilated, retained, coordinated with other faculties, and thus made of permanent benefit to the species. 9. In the meantime, that primordial impulse which has been denominated appetency, and which is the effective agency, par excellence, of progressive development, is the inseparable concomitant, if not indeed an integral element, of the instinct of self-preservation, and it is still as potential an element of every subjective intelligence as it was when the first group of amoebae united to form a multicellular organism. 10. It follows that every animal intelligence unites within itself the elements, not only for its own conservation, but for its progressive development, and, all being faculties of the subjective mind, they are transmissible by inheritance, and are consequently the permanent endowment of the species to which it belongs. 11. Again, as remarked at the close of the preceding chapter, the mental equipment of each individual animal, other things being equal, comprises the sum total of all its ancestral instincts, primary and secondary, that have remained useful, plus its objective, or reasoning, intelligence. 12. The foregoing considerations are at once explanatory and confirmative of the conclusion arrived at by Pouchet and Morgan, and admitted by Darwin, that animals possessing the most complex instincts are the most intelligent. We are now prepared to take one step further in tracing the processes of evolutionary development of mind on this planet. That there is no variableness or shadow of turning in the great first cause is an axiom that will not be disputed by the theologian who sees the hand of God in the processes of evolution, nor by the materialistic scientist who has convinced himself, by his peculiar processes of induction, that the evolutionary development of physical and mental organisms is the result of a blind operation of correlate forces inherent in matter. Neither of them should, therefore, be incredulous when he is told that the same laws and processes that develop the mental organism of animals, from the monarch to man, are the active agencies of man's progressive development from primitive savagery to the highest civilization, mental, moral, and religious. I have already remarked upon the fact that the great bulk of the intelligence of an animal is made up of its accumulated ancestral instincts and propensities, the brain intelligence being merely a useful adjunct specially adapted to the exigencies of a physical environment. This is obviously true for two reasons, namely, the comparatively limited brain, or objective, intelligence of animals, but especially because all the primary instincts and propensities were inherited from the skull-less animals of the primordial epoch. Now, if man is descended from the lower animals, it follows that the same is true of him, the only possible difference being one of degree or of modifications resulting from environmental conditions. A few words will make my meaning clear. That the primary instincts are shared in common by man and the lower animals does not admit of argument or dispute. These obviously belong to the primary intelligence, or the subjective mind, the mind that existed millions of years antecedent to the objective mind, of which the brain is the organ. The same is necessarily true of the secondary instincts, for they are but so many additions to the original stock of primary instincts. All instincts, therefore, belong to the subjective mind. Intuition, being but another name for a higher instinct, also belongs to the subjective mind, as also does its concomitant faculty of potentially inerrant deduction. The emotions of man are obviously identical with the animal propensities of his lower ancestors, and as they annotate the brain, they are necessarily faculties of the subjective mind. The higher emotions of man being but the modified, educated, regulated, and purified emotions or propensities of the lower animals, must all be classed as faculties of the subjective mind. Even the emotion of religious worship finds its root and origin in the intuitive recognition of the divine fatherhood. That the faculty of telepathy also belongs to the subjective mind has been amply demonstrated by researches in experimental psychology, notably those of the Society for Psychical Research. Whether animals possess that faculty in such a degree as to be able to communicate with each other, and if so to what extent, are mooted questions among scientists. It is, however, a well-established fact that man can impress certain domestic animals telepathically. Be that as it may be set down as axiomatic that any faculty that is found to exist in the subjective mind of man necessarily existed, potentially at least, in the minds of his ancestry, near and remote. It is, in fact, upon this fundamental truth that the vitality of evolutionary processes depends. Telekinetic energy, which has been variously designated as psychic force, Sir William Crookes, actinic force, Professor Thury, and telekinesis, Professor Cowes, is demonstrably a power or faculty of the subjective mind. This is true whether we attribute its phenomena to the embodied or to the disembodied souls of men. This, I scarcely need to remark, is the power to move ponderable bodies without physical contact or mechanical agencies. I shall have more to say of this force hereinafter. It is mentioned here only to complete the list of subjective faculties as set forth in the tabular statement in Chapter 2, to which the reader is again referred. In the meantime, I ask the reader to accept the statement, provisionally, that telekinetic energy belongs wholly to the subjective mind. I have reserved the faculty of memory for the last, because it is shared by the objective mind. Moreover, it is the only faculty that is shared by the two minds. But the points of differentiation are so numerous and so radical that they must be considered separately. The memory of the objective mind is merely the concomitant of induction, the latter being the only faculty belonging exclusively to the objective mind. As induction presupposes facts to reason from, its organ is necessarily endowed with a memory. But, like every other physical organ, the brain has its limitations of power, and these are extended by exercise and cultivation. Cerebral anatomists tell us that a new brain cell is created for every new objective experience. These cells, therefore, constitute receptacles for brain memories, and their efficiency depends upon constant or frequent refunctioning. If that is neglected, the cell necessarily atrophies, precisely as every other physical organ atrophies for lack of exercise. Hence the so-called imperfection, or evanescent character, of the memory of the objective mind. Hence, also, the common observation that our stock of knowledge is measured by what we remember and not by what we have learned. This is eminently true of both minds, but as the subjective mind is not dependent for its continued existence nor for its efficiency upon any physical organ or organism, its memory does not depend upon the continued refunctioning of brain cells, nor, indeed, of those of any other physical organ. Its memory is therefore an inherent power or faculty which defies the analysis of the physicist and cannot be eliminated with the scalpel. The subjective mind, therefore, is literally the storehouse of memory, for it retains and assimilates everything that the objective mind acquires, besides much of what the latter has never consciously possessed. Nor are these all of the memorial possessions of the subjective mind. As we have already seen in discussing animal instinct, whenever an action becomes instinctive, it is transmitted by inheritance to the posterity of the animal, and it is retained as the heritage of all future generations so long as it remains useful to the species. This being true alike of primary and secondary instincts, it follows that the subjective, or instinctive, mind of each animal is a storehouse, not only of memories of individual experiences, but of all its ancestral experiences that remain useful. That the same proposition is true of man's subjective mind it needs no argument to sustain. Nor must we lose sight of the correlative fact, which all intelligent naturalists now admit, that the higher the intelligence of animals the more complex are their instincts, and that the same is necessarily true of man. Then, when we reflect that the range and complexity of man's instinctive intelligence are constantly augmented by the multiplying variations of his environmental conditions incident to the progressive development of civilization, which in turn is constantly creating new wants and necessities of existence, physical, mental, moral, and spiritual, and as constantly revealing correlative dangers to be avoided or overcome, we may begin to realize how infinitely complex must be the instincts of man, when compared with those of the most intelligent of the lower animals. Again, as with the lower animals, so with man, acquired or secondary instincts, together with primary instincts, are transmitted by descent and remain as hereditament of the species so long as they remain useful. It follows that with man as with animals, the subjective mind is the storehouse of ancestral memories, and when we add to these the perfect memory of individual experiences and of acquired knowledge, however superficially it may have been impressed upon the objective mind, we may begin to approach a realization of what a vast storehouse of latent memorial intelligence is the subjective mind of the average civilized man. It will now be seen that it is true of man as it is of the lower animals, that the great bulk of his intelligence is resident in the subjective mind. The psychophysical faculty of inductive reasoning constitutes the only exception, and that faculty, as I have often repeated, is simply a highly specialized faculty which is the function of a highly differentiated physical organ, and is especially adapted to serve as a temporary guide through the mazes of a physical environment. But it is no more a permanent faculty of the ultimate ego than is any other physical function, and for precisely the same reason, it would be useless in any other than a physical environment. In dealing with the subjective mind of man, therefore, we are dealing with all that goes to make up the real man, all, indeed, that could contribute to a perfect manhood in an environment of truth. We are dealing with all of man that can possibly survive the dissolution of the physical investiture, all that is worth preserving for the future life. But it must not be forgotten that we are also dealing with an entity whose every faculty is essential and is moreover especially adapted to the existence of a disembodied soul in an environment of perfect truth point when it remains to inquire how this entity has been developed since man appeared. This inquiry will necessarily include the evolution of civilization from savagery and incidentally of the evolution of man as a moral and religious being. This, of course, is a vast subject to treat which exhaustively would require many volumes. I shall therefore be compelled to content myself with a brief generalization, my principal object being to state the general psychological principles involved in the process of development.